Okay, so this is the tail end of the Chapter 12 material on nervous system physiology. This is going to be a brief discussion about synapses, which remember from our coverage of the muscle tissue physiology, we talked about the neuromuscular junction, or the NMJ. So our neuromuscular junction is the point where you have a synapse between your axon terminal of a neuron and your muscle tissue. So any point where we have a neuron coming into contact with a target tissue or another neuron, in the case of sensory neurons forming the circuit with interneurons forming the circuit with motor neurons, any point of contact like that is going to be referred to as a synapse. So once you have the action potential propagated down the entire length of that axon to the axon terminal, your nerve signal can't go any further than that. So that's when you have your release of a neurotransmitter. So the action potential reaching those synaptic knobs at the very end of the axon is ultimately what triggers the release of a neurotransmitter. And a neurotransmitter, remember, is just a chemical message. So the neurotransmitter is going to essentially diffuse across a synaptic cleft, and then it's going to be received by special proteins on the plasma membrane of the cell that is the postsynaptic cell. So ultimately, this is going to stimulate a new wave of electrical activity in the next cell that's across that synapse. So the synapse between two neurons, we can name the neurons that are forming that connection. The one that is ultimately releasing the neurotransmitter is known as the presynaptic neuron. And then the neuron that is receiving that neurotransmitter, responding to that, is the postsynaptic neuron. So pre, before, post, after. We're just going to be describing the relationship of these neurons in that connection there. Now, don't concern yourself too much with the terms here. I'm not going to be asking you about those on the quiz, for example. Those are just specific terms to describe where you have your presynaptic neurons synapsing. So a presynaptic nerve is going to either synapse with a dendrite, a soma, or an axon of your postsynaptic neuron, and a neuron can have an enormous number of synapses. So typically when we're first learning about how action potentials work and communication between neurons, we're thinking about this in a very simplified linear fashion, where you have your neuron leading to another neuron, and it's just this very simple little linear pathway. But in reality, you can have so many different patterns of synapses. You can have an infinite number of synapse configurations, and you can have synapses occurring all along the soma and all along the axon or the dendrites. So a single motor neuron is covered by, on average, about 10,000 synaptic knobs from other neurons. 8,000 that are ending on its dendrites and 2,000 that are ending on its soma. And then in the cerebellum of the brain, a single neuron can have as many as 100,000 synapses. So it's really quite remarkable just how many connections can occur within our nervous system. So this is just a schematic that shows the overview of synapses. So we have our multiple configurations here of synapses, and again, this is generally how we illustrate it for purposes of understanding the fact that you generally have kind of a relay system of action potentials going from one synapse to another. So this would be your synapse itself, where you have your axon terminal of your presynaptic neuron coming into contact with the next soma in your postsynaptic neuron. And then this just shows the fact that you do have many different types of configurations. So you can have your presynaptic neuron here coming into contact with the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron here. That would be an axodendritic synapse. Your axosomatic synapse is going to be where your axon of your presynaptic neuron is contacting the soma of your postsynaptic neuron. And then you can also have what's known as an axoaxonic synapse, where you have the axon terminal of your presynaptic neuron coming into contact with the axon of your postsynaptic. The structure of a chemical synapse is going to be familiar to you if you remember our talk about the neuromuscular junction, but basically you have your synaptic knob of your presynaptic neuron containing these essentially little bubbles of neurotransmitter. So they have these little membranous vesicles that contain your neurotransmitter. And you have many of these vesicles docked on release sites on the plasma membrane that are ready to release neurotransmitter when a signal arrives and prompts them to do that. So essentially, you're always going to have a steady supply of neurotransmitter, and there's also a reserve pool of synaptic vesicles that's located further away from the membrane. And your postsynaptic neuron, of course, has to have some way of responding to the neurotransmitter. So it's generally going to have proteins that are highly specific that function as receptors and ligand-gated ion gates, or ligand-regulated ion gates, meaning you have to have a specific chemical binding to that protein in order to open up an ion gate. So here we have a depiction here of your presynaptic neuron. This would be a synaptic knob. So the very terminal end of an axon here that contains your little membranous vesicles that are filled with neurotransmitter. Once the action potential reaches this point, that's going to prompt those synaptic vesicles to essentially fuse with your membrane along the synaptic knob, release your neurotransmitter, and then your neurotransmitter is going to come into contact with these specialized neurotransmitter receptors. And just to show you just how complex an actual chemical synapse can be, this would be, of course, many chemical synapses. So every time you have a connection between a synaptic knob and the soma, in this case, of your postsynaptic neuron, that's an individual chemical synapse. So every single one of these knobs is forming a chemical synapse with the soma of this postsynaptic neuron. So you're going to have release of neurotransmitter from all of these when action potentials reach those axon terminals. And then finally, we have this neuromuscular junction. We've seen this slide before, where we have our connection between a neuron and its target tissue, in this case, skeletal muscle tissue. Okay, so that's going to wrap up the Chapter 12 material. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you for listening, and good luck, and use your study time wisely.